Hello everyone and welcome to the Emerging Markets Forum. So we are genuinely excited to bring you the fourth in this annual conference series. Four conferences seems like a ripe old age, and I'm glad to see you all here. Today's event is brought to you by the Center for International Business Education and Research and the Office of Global Initiatives at the Robert H. Smith School of Business. I'm Kislaya Prasad, the Director of Cyber, and I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to tell you a bit about the center as well as the conference series. So the Smith School Cyber is one of a network of 33 such centers established by Congress. And our mission is to further international understanding and to enhance the ability of US businesses to prosper in the world economy. So we do this by organizing a range of events, including international programs for students, programs for faculty, conferences like these, and a range of other things. So in recent years, there's been much interest in emerging markets. So 3 years back, we started the Emerging Markets Forum series in recognition of the importance that an expanding group of countries, but starting from Brazil, China, India, and others, have assumed for the United States. There was a great need for our students and also for the general public to have much greater awareness of what is happening in these new economies. So the inaugural conference, which was titled The Rise of New Economic Powers and America's Future, focused on two important issues. We first critically examined the notion that the rise of new economic powers happens at the expense of the United States. And there was a spirited exchange on that, as you might imagine. But the first conference also looked at a second issue, and it looked at how emerging markets are now becoming powerhouses of innovation. So that was a second important issue that we discussed. Then the year after, we turned to the gender side of the emerging market story, and we looked at the role of women and how those are being transformed by these major economic transformations taking place in emerging markets. Finally, last year, I think we turned to a lot of the recent problems that emerging markets have been facing, but also looked at the role that the diaspora community has been playing in facilitating commerce with emerging markets. Which brings me to this year's conference. The theme this time is Negotiating History, Culture, and Institutions, and our particular focus is the Islamic world. Now, these are vast themes, and I don't think we can cover them sufficiently in one small day, but I do think you can expect to learn a lot today. So in the first half of the day, we'll be focusing on the role of history, culture, and institutions in shaping the business environment in emerging markets. And then in the second half, we will focus specifically on the Islamic world, and we'll be looking at how these themes are relevant to understanding, and more than that, functioning effectively in emerging markets. Additionally, I hope we can contribute in a small way to a more constructive engagement with what is really 1/4 of the world's population. So we've assembled a really exciting lineup of speakers for you, and I'm looking forward to it with great anticipation, and I hope you will enjoy it too. So before it'll be my honor to introduce Joyce, but before I do that, I do want to thank some of our sponsors. None of this would have been possible without them. Cyber receives major funding from the US Department of Education. Personally, I think Title VI grants are one of the best things that our government does. And I would like to express my appreciation and support. I would also like to acknowledge support from the George Washington University Cyber. I met the George Washington contingent. I don't see Reed Click yet here, but when you see him, tell him that I appreciate his support here. The cyber program, we're a collaborative network, and that network has been very valuable. So while I do value the financial support very much, the encouragement that I've received from colleagues at George Washington has meant a lot. I would like to acknowledge support from the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center. This beautiful room has added a lot to the atmosphere of Emerging Markets Forum, and this is a result of this sponsorship. I don't see Alison McKitten, but she's going to be here later in the day, so I express my gratitude to her. The Smith School's Emerging Market Association, they've been wonderful in their support. First, you'll see a number of volunteers. You probably met them already when you registered, but throughout the day you'll see volunteers from the EMA. I don't want to forget, they're hosting a reception for everybody at 4 p.m., so you're all invited to the reception. I hope you can join us then. So with my thanks, it is now my honor to introduce Dr. Joyce Russell, who has very kindly agreed to inaugurate the conference. Dr. Russell is the Vice Dean of the Smith School and made an immediate and noticeable difference at the school when she took on this leadership role. Of course, that's not a surprise because she's a distinguished scholar and a teacher of leadership. Students routinely, and I think I've had more than one student tell me this, identify her class on leadership as the single most important, meaningful experience of their MBA education. Beyond Smith, she has served in a management development role with some of the leading corporations in this country. It would probably take too long to list all the accolades, accomplishments, and awards that Joyce has received for her teaching and for her writing. But I will mention one thing: if you haven't had the good fortune to take a class with Joyce, you can still read her wonderful column, Career Coach, in the Washington Post and the Capital Business Journal. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joyce Russell.
Well, I really appreciate that very nice introduction, and I also want to, so thank you, Kisleya. I'm very excited to be participating in this signature event for the Smith School of Business. We have a number of key events, and this is really one of them, so we're so delighted that you're all here. We also want to, of course, welcome you to the Ronald Reagan Building and the International Trade Center, and for those of you who don't know, this is one of the locations where we actually host many of our events at the Smith School of Business, and in particular our part-time MBA program is often here, our weekend MBA program, and as we said, a number of different kinds of events. And part of the reason for that is because we've wanted at the Smith School to really have a vibrant presence in the nation's capital, and so that's why we've had so many things. We really try to build our partnerships. So I'm going to give you just a little backdrop on the Smith School if you don't mind. But we try to build our partnerships with some of the embassies, with the companies. We have a lot of alumni that work in the city. And so that's why we really try to keep this close connection to DC. Just a little bit about the Robert A. Smith School of Business, as some of you know, and I'm really delighted that we have so many partners here from various schools, from the University of Delaware, from George Washington, from Georgia. We have a number of different partners, and it's wonderful that we're doing these collaborative things together. But I will brag a little bit about the Smith School right now, and just to tell you that we are highly ranked in all of our programs. And if you don't know, we have about 5,000 students, about 3,000 in our undergraduate program. We have 5 different MS programs. We have a part-time MBA, a full-time MBA, a College Park EMBA, a China EMBA, an online MBA. So we have a variety of programs that we do, a real portfolio, and they're all ranked within the top 25 in the nation. So we're very proud of our programming here. In addition to those programs, though, we are very proud of our global outreach. We feel like that's very important, and you can see from our screen up there all the different places, the countries around the world where Smith has been engaged. And our students really represent 96 countries. 30% of our faculty come from different countries. We have 55,000 alum, and they work in 58 different countries. We have exchange partnerships with schools in Asia, Australia, Europe, the Middle East, and actually the Dean and I are constantly looking for additional partnerships with top-ranked universities around the world. So that's really important to us, is the whole global presence. We are also pleased to be part of the Global Business School Network, and that's a consortium, as some of you know, of 70 different business schools, the top schools in 29 countries, both representing the developed and developing worlds. So this academic year alone, if we just look at what the students have done, more than 600 of our Smith undergraduate and graduate students have studied abroad or worked in international internships or carried out consulting projects. And so the fact that our Office of Global Initiatives is here with Melissa, and I see Matt and a number of other people, this is really a strong core of what we do at the Smith School, and we're extremely proud of all the work that they do. Out of the 12 colleges in the University of Maryland system, Smith sends the highest number of students abroad each year, and we're very excited about that. We also host a number of international students. I've had the pleasure of teaching in some of those programs. We host about 170 incoming international students, and that would be for short-term courses or semester abroad. And I think it's fabulous for all of us when we're working with people from all over the world just to understand the kinds of things that are important to them, the issues that they're facing, et cetera. So I think that's been really enriching, not just for them, but for us as well. We know that the Smith's Office of Global Initiatives really has, it's not just about sending people out places, but it's about what we're doing on campus. And so we do have this robust set of on-campus co-curricular programs. You see Rebecca back there who's working on a lot of these as well. And today's program is really part of that whole objective to enhance the global mindset that people have. As Kaslea was pointing out, this conference is really the culminating event in a 6-part series that we're conducting this academic year that is called Challenges to Doing Business in Emerging Markets. So the speakers that we've had in this whole series have included, if you haven't attended some of those, the Finance Minister of Chile, the former senior World Bank and State Department officials, and a number of our own faculty members. And we find that a number of students are very excited about this area, many of whom want to study in terms of globally. In a survey of our own MBA students, we found that more than 80% stated that they were interested in a career in global business. Nearly 90% of the MBAs have actually said that they have been involved in these global experiential learning opportunities, which, like I say, could be internships or consulting projects. And they've said that all these have been really valuable to their career. And once again, this speaks to the importance of a global mindset and how they can really enhance a person's career. Even when we talk to the undergraduates, our Smith sophomores, 89% reported having traveled abroad already. I think that's just fantastic. It certainly wasn't the case when I was going through school a few years back. And I think it's just wonderful that people are taking advantage of these types of opportunities. Some of them spending more than a month studying abroad, learning foreign languages. And like our MBAs, about 80% of our sophomores said that they're also interested in careers in global business. So as you can see, the Smith School is really well positioned to host this type of international event. We're very excited to be here. And as Kaslea said, it's taken an enormous number of people to really support this. And we're delighted that so many of you have come from different schools. Before I introduce our keynote, morning keynote speaker, I'd just like to say, really take advantage of the day. You're going to have some fabulous panels and really great opportunities to network with each other. So I certainly hope that you enjoy the day, that you really have an opportunity to learn some new things and get to meet some of the people that are here, as well as some of the other people that will be joining you. So with that, I'd like to introduce sort of a co-colleague in terms of our backgrounds, but our morning keynote speakers, just fabulous that you have Dr. Michele Gelfand here, who is the professor of psychology and a distinguished university scholar teacher at the University of Maryland. And that's a very prestigious award that is not given out to too many people. So it just really speaks to not only her scholarship, but her phenomenal teaching as well. In fact, in the business school, she's so popular, we keep having her come and teach for us so many classes because she's really wonderful. Her work, her research work is just perfect for this conference. It explores cultural influences on conflict, negotiation, justice, and revenge, which I think is rather interesting, workplace diversity and discrimination, and theory and methods in cross-cultural psychology. And she's published in all the top-tier journals Journal of Applied Psychology, Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, Academy Management Review, Academy Management Journal. I could go on and on because she is a very prolific publisher and scholar. She also co-edits a number of handbooks that deal with social and organizational psychology. She's also received some other prestigious awards in the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, the Ernest J. McCormick Award for Early Career Contributions, as well as the L.L. Cummings Scholar Award from the Organizational Behavior Division of the Academy of Management, and is the past president of the International Association of Conflict Management. So you're going to have a person up here who really has the background to speak about this topic. And she's currently the principal investigator on a multi-university research initiative to study culture and negotiation in the Middle East. She teaches courses, as I said, in negotiation, diversity, and cross-cultural management. And is just a fabulous teacher. So I know you're going to really enjoy this keynote. So with that, I'd like to invite her up.
Really a delight to be here. It's going to be a really phenomenal day. And the title of my talk is Cultural Constraints, Understanding Difference Between Tight and Loose Cultures in a Globalized World. I don't really need to convince you how important it is to understand cultural differences in the world today. It's really unsurpassed in human history, just the sheer amount of cross-cultural contact that you see around the globe. Every year, over 175 million people migrate across national borders. 1 in 35 people live in a country different than where they were born. Globalization has brought people of different cultures together in unprecedented levels with everyday new mergers and acquisitions and global ventures. And also global pressing concerns, including protecting the environment, requires cooperation at the international and local levels. And of course, in a world of global threats and terrorism, arguably understanding cultural differences could be a matter of life and death. For all of those reasons, people like myself who study culture and its implications are really interested in the basic science of cultural differences. How can we understand the way in which people vary around the world? How can we understand this thing we call culture? And we're also interested in this with an eye of reducing cross-cultural misunderstandings, which happen on a daily basis with a variety of different consequences. Many of us who think about cross-cultural misunderstandings first might be reminded of sort of subtle differences in language that cause problems when people interact. So for example, some of you might have seen this problem in mistranslation when Mike Wallace was interviewing Boris Yeltsin and asked him if he had a thin skin when it came to public criticism, but in fact, he was telling him he was a thick-skinned hippopotamus. And Yeltsin was not particularly amused. You see a lot of these other examples. Ford had a problem in Brazil when the Pinto flopped. It turns out that that's Brazilian slang for tiny male genitals, not a very good marketing campaign. One of my favorites, Chicken Man, Frank Perdue's slogan, "It takes a tough man to make a tender chicken," got terribly mangled in the Spanish translation, and this appeared all over Mexico. The billboards said, "It takes a hard man to make a chicken aroused." And so this was probably a very subtle, translation problem. You'd think people in the marketing department might have caught that. You see also examples of this in public culture. Those of you that go abroad might see some kind of strange things in public culture. Here's an example of a recycling bin at 7-Eleven in Seoul. Apparently this is for cans, bottles, and pets. My dog Pepper was not amused, just as Yeltsin wasn't. And you can see this in China, smart noshing makes you slobber. These are obviously just very small, kind of comical issues that cause mistranslations that may be kind of funny to the kind of insulting. But of course, many of us who are interested in culture are interested in a much deeper level and how it affects us profoundly as human beings, how we're socialized as individuals to be good cultural citizens in ways that are really out of our conscious awareness. Dating from the 1960s in anthropology and psychology, political science, sociology, people have had varying definitions of culture. Over 160 definitions by the 1960s. Here's just a couple of examples. Gerd Hofstede thought about this as sort of computer programming. Maybe the hardware is similar, but we have different software. Skinner, a psychologist, behaviorist, more on the economic side, thought about culture as a set of reinforcements. Gerd's an anthropologist, more was thinking about culture as historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbols, like the American flag or baseball, apple pie, and so forth. Of course, there's great diversity across many definitions of culture. Many of us would argue that there's some common aspects to all definitions of culture, and I'll highlight a couple of those. First of all, many definitions of culture include that there's some kind of objective nature to this. You can see it in artifacts that are out there, roads, housing, the way we organize our houses, the fact that my daughters have their own room that reflects the value of privacy that's very important in the United States is a good indicator of culture. Of course, it also manifests itself in subjective culture in terms of underlying values and norms and beliefs that we're socialized as individuals who often share a same language in the same time and in the same place, although that is something that in the globalized world is getting obviously something that makes for cultural transmission to be much more rapid. And it also is something that's transmitted. We're uniquely human as a species because we can transmit norms and standards for behavior across generations. And finally, I'll say, and something that I'll point out during the talk today, is that many of us would argue that cultural differences are adaptive, or at least quasi-adaptive or functional in some ecological and historical context. That is to say, there's a reason why they develop, and we need to understand those underlying reasons to promote cross-cultural understanding. I think many of us who study culture think about it as multi-layered. Culture as an iceberg is one of the favorite metaphors that I think about with culture, because you can see often at the very surface behavior, like what people are wearing, language, artifacts, institutions, but beneath that, what's visible is really where the action of culture is in terms of basic assumptions and values and beliefs. And those are the things that we really need to understand. Because if we just look at the visible artifacts, then we really are not getting at the gist of what culture is. So what I want to spend much of my time talking today about is what are certain ways that cultures vary, and one particular aspect of culture that I've been interested in for the last 10 or so years. And I think this is a very important way in which cultures vary, and I'm going to try to dissect how this difference arises and how it manifests itself, and toward the end of the talk, some of the implications for organizations and for intercultural interaction. What we label this, I will say just before I forget that what's really ironic about culture is that it's omnipresent, it's all around us, but it tends to be invisible. It's something we totally take for granted until we come back, as T.S. Eliot had said, and we sort of come back after being away. Many of you have experienced this as students. You finally realize, wow, I've really been socialized in a particular culture. And it takes us that sort of stepping out of that context to finally realize how omnipresent and invisible culture really is. So let me sort of tell you about one of the most important dimensions that I think that's dominating the geopolitical scene that is a critical cultural divide. And we refer to this as tightness and looseness. Tightness and looseness, the gist of it is basically how strong social norms are in different locales around the world. So in some contexts, in groups, norms are very strong. They're very clearly defined, and there's very little tolerance for deviance from norms. There's a great degree of sanctioning when people violate norms. Whereas in other contexts, which we call loose, norms are much more ambiguous, and there's a lot more tolerance for deviance from them. This is a construct, actually, that was first discussed in anthropology in the late 60s by Piero Pelto, who studied over 22 traditional societies and found that groups like the Hutterites, the Hano, and the Libera had very clear norms. They were very, very formal. They were disciplined, and there were severe sanctions for deviance. Compared to other groups, the Kung Bushmen, the Kubeo, the Skull Laps, which had fewer norms, they had much less formality, and there was a wide range of deviant behavior. This concept actually was very important, as denoted by him. It actually was replicated in the Human Area Relation Files some years later and found to be different than other cultural dimensions. But it really kind of fell off the intellectual map for some time. And we started to make sort of question, can this core contrast between predictability and order versus latitude and permissiveness, when you find this in modern societies? And what explains why might we have differences in this kind of contrast? So I'm going to kind of talk to you about the research we've done on this. I'll say that anecdotally you can see sort of little artifacts of tightness and looseness when you travel abroad, and various headlines you might see. For example, you might wonder why it's okay to pop the bubble in the United States and why it's illegal to bring in large quantities of gum into Singapore, for example. Be careful if you do that. You might wonder why it's okay to flip the bird in New York City. Many of us from New York actually think it's an affectionate thing to do. Versus you might get thrown in the slammer for it in Dubai. You might wonder why it's okay to openly use drugs in Amsterdam, but you might get the death penalty for this in Malaysia, as well as the wide range of behavior that you see in some contexts, including various scantily dressed people, versus that this is severely penalized in some contexts. You might see that there's really big differences in whether or not dissent is allowed in certain contexts versus celebrated in others. And also other contexts where we have a lot of cross-cultural conflict, even at the level of international relations. For example, many of you might remember in the early 90s, the famous caning incident in Singapore where an American was caned for vandalizing and engaging in graffiti in Singapore. And this engaged the top level officials in the US and Singapore to try to reduce this cross-cultural misunderstanding, with Americans thinking this is really far off base kind of punishment for this behavior, whereas Singaporeans were very, very steadfast in saying this was a just deserved punishment. So we were interested in how can we understand modern societies and how they vary on tightness, looseness. We're interested in not only do they differ, but why do they differ? And why, what are the ecological, historical, and sociopolitical correlates of this construct? Can we measure it? Can we see variation? And can we predict which cultures, which groups might be tighter or looser? How do everyday situations vary in tight and loose cultures? And how do people psychologically get trained differently in tight and loose cultures? We're also interested in this, is this a core contrast that applies across levels of analysis? Can we find that this contrast can help us explain variability in the United States? Can we think about tightness looseness at the 50-state level? And the answer is actually yes. We can see really some reliable differences in the 50 states that I'm going to show you shortly. And as well as can we see some underlying neuropsychological evidence for how people think differently in different cultures. I'm going to talk at the end about this sort of quintessential question of, like, is there an optimal level? Is tightness or looseness, which one is better? People constantly ask me, and we're going to talk about the answer is yes later on in the talk. So I do want to also end later talking about how I think there's great, tremendous potential for misunderstanding along this dimension, and we'll get to that toward the end. But first, let me just describe that we did a 33-nation study that was published a couple of years ago in Science on this construct. This involves many people that are listed here. God bless them. This took many, many years, this study. This is a study that involves survey research, archival data analysis, observations in nations, and a lot of back translations. And for someone who's a cross-cultural psychologist, I'm humbled by managing a group of this size who's multicultural, because you really have to walk the talk and really understand how to manage cultural differences in your own research team. And in this particular case, we're really interested in looking at tightness looseness as a system. Many people talk about culture at the very superficial level, and we're trying to understand what are the different levels of analysis at which this construct is really found, and how do these levels relate to each other? Because, as you'll see later, there's really a pattern that you can see across levels that makes these systems stay in place. And it's very hard to change, although we can start to think about how do we change, if we wanted to, the system, and it involves multiple levels. So the answer is that it's very hard to change unless you are diagnosing different levels and how they're situated. I'm going to show you a scale that we developed that was given out. This is just some sample items. And we simply asked people, these are working adults and also students around the world, for things like, we asked them, are there many social norms that people have to abide by in this country? If someone acts in an appropriate way, will others disapprove? Do people have great freedom in how they can behave? And how many people really comply with social norms? Among many other questions that had to do with the strength of norms and tolerance for deviance, how much people are sanctioned for inappropriate behavior. What we found, which was very important to us, is that people actually agree on this. Even in loose societies, people agree, this is evidenced in RWG and ICC values, that the place is pretty loose. I'm showing you a rank order where you can see some of the variation with Pakistan and Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea falling very high in our construct, Brazil, the Netherlands, Israel, Hungary, Estonia, etc., falling quite low, Germany and Austria, and as well as the United Kingdom were actually moderately tight in our data, and the US is actually moderately loose. I'm going to get into state level variation. I would also argue that there's regional variation in many countries, so I sort of alert you to that. This is a general yardstick that we're looking at in this particular study, but that you can zoom in at different levels of analysis. And I'll talk about some interesting exceptions to some of the theory that we tested a little bit later on. What you can see is that when we look at what does this scale relate to, you can see that in countries that are tight, people tend to believe that moral transgressions are less justifiable. They tend to agree on that as well. They have lower standard deviations. There's a greater pressure toward uniformity in tight cultures. There's actually fewer left-handed writers from our analysis. Left-handedness is seen as kind of deviant in many places. There's actually greater accuracy in public clocks around the world in tight versus loose cultures in our analysis. So in very tight cultures, if you go around city streets, a lot of the clocks agree with each other. In other contexts, like in Brazil, if you go around city streets, clocks say something completely different. This is really a coordination mechanism that you'll see is important in tight cultures. But this is just to say that we can look at this unobtrusively as well. And also, attitudes toward people who are different are much more negative in tight as compared to loose cultures. And there's fewer percentages of immigrants actually in tight cultures. I want to mention that also, we want to look at that this differs from other cultural constructs. This is Harry Trandis, who's my advisor. He's one of the founding fathers of cross-cultural psychology. And he was guessing that, for example, the correlation between tightness and familialism, or what people call collectivism, was about 0.4. This is what he predicted. He's giving me a Schlitz beer in Champaign-Urbana there. That's a long story. But in any event, we found that this construct is highly distinct from others that exist in the literature in terms of individualism or in terms of other values found from the Globe Project. It's also independent of GDP. So there are tight cultures that are rich, and there are tight cultures that are poor. There are loose cultures that are tight, or that are poor, and there are loose cultures that are rich. But let me sort of get to the gist of what I want to kind of instill upon you, which is that these variation in this very important cultural difference comes out of, in part, ecology and history. And Harry said many years ago that ecological factors and historical events influence the social organization of a country, which in turn affects the social situations we encounter and psychological processes. Now, this is a lot of words, right? This is sort of a lot to kind of unpack. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to see, is there an ecological foundation of tightness, and historical foundation? And what you're going to see is a lot of commonality at both the international level and the state level. So let me just show you some of the data. I'll say that our assumption going into this project was that strong norms and sanctions function for something. There's a reason why they develop, in general. And they function to reduce the range of permissible behavior and to help organize social action and to coordinate social action. And so our next assumption was that in some countries around the world and in some states, that actually coordinated social action is much more important. And that's more important in contexts where there's a severe degree of threat. And you can think about societal threat in two different ways. One is human-made threats to survival. These are things like how much conflict do we have on our territory. The US has been blessed, with some exceptions, but not having a lot of threats from Canada and Mexico invading our territory all the time, whereas other countries, Korea, Japan, Germany, and so forth, have had a lot of facing of territorial threats. Also, high population density is another threat that some countries have to deal with. Natural threats are also important. These are things that come from natural disasters, from resource scarcity, and so forth. And so our prediction was that, in part, tightness is an adaptation to threat. So countries where you find, in states, higher degrees of threat, you'll have the need for more coordinated social action and greater constraint. And that's exactly what we found. I'm just going to show you a couple of the data points. We found that population density, which varies dramatically around the world. For some of you that have been to Singapore know that's about 18,000 people per square mile, compared to Brazil, which is about 60 people per square mile. The United States, about 85 people per square mile. Of course, that varies by region. But in places where there's a very high population density, there's a great degree of potential chaos. Just imagine what it's like to live in Singapore, where you're constantly having to watch out where you're going. And that's where a place where tightness can be very functional. And in fact, Lee Kuan Yew had declared an embargo on large degree of gum, as I showed you, because it was very important. In Singapore, there was a time when people kept taking their gum, as we all sort of every so often do, and toss it on the ground. And this became a hazard, a massive hazard, public health hazard. How can you walk around the streets when there's gum all over the place, when there's 18,000 people per square mile? So in this case, it makes sense to think about an adaptation of a cultural difference. We also found that even population density in 1500 predicts tightness today. Other threats, ecological threats, as I mentioned, are also very important in contexts where there's low resource scarcity, where there's less arable land, where you have to cultivate rice, which requires a lot of interdependence, and people who deviate from the norms can really disrupt survival propensity. You'll also find that there's greater tightness. So there's greater tightness in countries that have natural disaster vulnerability, lack of natural resources, and lower food supply. Japan is a great example, by the way, of a country that is very high on threat. When this paper came out and hit the media, the Japanese government was very interested to see that they're an outlier on all of these threats. And they were saying to themselves, wow, we can see now why we're so rule-based and we have a lot of sanctions, why that makes sense in this context. And so that's one example. Another example is historical threats. Can we sort of look at how many times a country has been threatened by its neighbor on its own soil? And we can see through political science databases that have tracked this, that this predicts the number of times over the last 100 years you've been threatened by your neighbors actually predicts tightness today. I want to mention that sheer involvement in conflict around the world is not related to tightness. The United States is involved in a lot of conflict, just not on its own soil. And in fact, indicators from this database show that just involvement in foreign conflict is not predictive of tightness, but having conflict on your own soil is. I would also mention that you can see after 9/11, the rhetoric that we had in the US, after we did have a threat, or after the Boston bombing, you see dialogue, discourse around issues of tightness. Should we become tighter? Should we have more sanctions for deviant behavior? Because we need to coordinate. And you can see that that resulted in some increases in surveillance, and we still debate about this with recent events, and including also the Patriot Act. But nevertheless, the US has not had a terrible amount of threats, doesn't have a lot of ecological threats, so it promotes looseness, even given some random and temporary threats that we have. Disease is another predictor of tightness in contexts where you have a lot of pathogen prevalence, especially tuberculosis, where that can be spread easily. It makes a lot of sense to have strong norms and little tolerance for deviance. I want to just mention that, and I'm going to skip over these slides for time, but clearly tightness is also reinforced by societal institutions. So we can think about the media, we can think about government, we can think about educational systems having more or less constraint. And in tight societies, there's much more constraint in the media, there's less openness of the media, and that helps people to maintain more coordination. Educational settings, there's much more monitoring and sanction of deviance in places like Japan and the US and China as compared to the US, and so forth. So it's reinforced tightness by institutions as well. It's reinforced by also institutions such as criminal system, the sanctions that we have for crimes, number of police per capita, and so forth. So I want to just mention, this is really the more macro part of this model. We're looking at how you can understand basic cultural differences, not this kind of superficial elements, but things that are deep-seated in cultures and that are quasi-adaptive to their ecological and historical context. I want to just mention that we also look at this really in terms of everyday situations. This is what I mentioned earlier. I unpacked the ecological historical foundations and socio-political institutions and how they reflect and support strong norms, but really how this reflects in everyday life, where we are living our everyday lives out, in movie theaters, in the banks, in classrooms, in organizations, is really things that we're all interested in. These are very distal macro factors, but we're interested in culture and how it manifests itself in everyday situations, and also in how psychology is also supporting that, individual differences in how we see the world, and how we monitor our impulses, and so forth. And we're interested in this aspect of social situations that reinforces constraint versus latitude. And the punchline really is that in different cultures, we face very different situations. We sample situations that are quite different. And we're interested in this project, and what we showed in the science paper was that in tight societies, there's a great degree of strong situations. That is to say that people exist in contexts where there's much more constraint in terms of what is permissible, and situations that are strong leave little room for discretion. By comparison, weak situations place far fewer constraints on people, and there's a wide range of behavioral options that are available. So I would ask you, for example, because clearly in every country we have strong and weak situations, what kind of situation is this situation? Strong or weak? It's a pretty strong situation. If I start dancing up here, which I often would like to do, or get on the phone, or break out a sandwich, or start lighting a cigarette, you would probably look at me a little strange. This is an example of a very strong situation where we have constraints on our behavior. And what I would tell you is that all cultures have strong and weak situations, but that the degree to which they're constrained varies tremendously. So if you think about it in a very extreme analog, in extreme tight context, it's like living in a library a lot of your life, or living in a job interview, where we know that we are really focused on managing our impulses, focused on the situation, on what we need to do, because we know if we don't, we'll be censored, just like you would if I started dancing up here. And that's precisely what we measured in this study. We asked people, how appropriate are various behaviors across different situations? And you'll see these pictures here, that this is one of these implicit things that we kind of know that there are strong and weak situations, the library, funeral, and public lecture, but that in fact, or vice versa, public park, own room, and drinks in DC will be example tonight, maybe at the cocktail hour being weaker situations, that are weaker situations. But we sample, primarily in tight cultures, situations that are weaker, and we sample contexts that are more strong in tight societies. And I just want to show you that we examined this by asking people all around the world. This is just an example. I'll just say that you can see this in public culture. For anyone that's been on the metro in Tokyo, you see just a ton of different rules. You can't wear makeup, you can't sleep, don't bother your neighbors, it looks like don't kind of hang outside the door. I'm not sure that needs to be said. But in any event, lots and lots of rules. And you look at the New York subway, and I tried to find this in DC too, far fewer rules. And so this is just an example that you can see this in different contexts in public culture. We ask people directly how constrained their situations. How appropriate is it to argue in a bank, to laugh at the doctor's office, to curse in an interview? Not a good idea, but does happen. To eat on a bus, to kiss in a restaurant, to bargain in the library, to read a newspaper in a classroom. That's my pet peeve. I had to have that in this survey. To sing on a city sidewalk, to talk in an elevator. And we did this across 12 behaviors across 15 situations. And we were able to also ask people direct ratings of constraint. How much are you monitoring your behavior, or do you have to watch what you're doing in these particular contexts, in the bank, in the doctor's office, elevator, the movies, etc. And we were able to come up with indices of situational constraint by collapsing across behaviors. And what you could see is really interesting, that across the world, there is a universal ranking of situational constraint. People all around the world agree that being in the library, being in a job interview is a much stronger situation than being in your bedroom or being in a public park. But the degree of constraint varies dramatically. And you can just see here, just one example, that being in a library, lower scores on this slide that's very messy, means that it's more constrained. You can see a library is the strongest situation in all these countries, but that it's much weaker in New Zealand than it is in Pakistan. Likewise, being at a party is a much stronger situation, even though it's comparatively weaker in Pakistan than New Zealand. So you can see that we can start thinking about culture as how is it affecting what we're experiencing on an everyday basis. I want to close the loop on this project by just saying that we're also, as a psychologist, interested in how do people vary psychologically. You can't have a lot of strong situations in a country and not have the associated psychological process that help make them up and reinforce them. And what we were interested in showing is that people have psychological adaptations. They're trained by their parents, by their teachers, to adapt and effortlessly reproduce those situations. And what we found was that in societies that have high constraint, there's a greater prevention focus. This is through some HLM analyses. The people are more cautious, they're more rule-oriented, they have higher self-regulation and more self-monitoring, and they also have more closed-mindedness. Versus in the US or other weak contexts, situational contexts, it's more functional to have a lot of tolerance for ambiguity, because the fact is you'll encounter situations where a lot of random events are going to be happening. There's such weaker situations. So I want to just mention that we tested this model as a multi-level structural equation model. That's to say that you can start seeing the connections of these different types of variables, from very distal factors to very micro factors, and how they all interrelate and make each other up. So how am I doing on time? I just need to check. There's no clock up here. How many minutes would you say I have? Okay, great. So I do want to say that what we learned in this project, and this is on my website for anyone interested, is that we do see wide variation on the strength of norms, that there are some predictable correlates, ecological, historical, and sociopolitical, and that you could see this construct as operating as a system. And we're very interested to see, does this important cultural contrast apply to other levels of analysis? And so I want to sort of switch to the state level before drawing some organizational implications. I do want to say that I think it's important from a perspective of cross-cultural understanding that when we're going abroad to places like Singapore, or people are coming here, that we are able to say, well, we see now we can diagnose countries that are different in how strong their norms are, and we can understand why did they develop the way they did, because that's really can help people to become much less ethnocentric. You can understand, well, if I was born in a place that had this much population density, maybe I would have more impulse control, maybe I would have it'd be more important to have caning than it is in a context where you have much less threat. And I think it helps to kind of de-bias people once they see that these cultural differences are not just kind of random. Some are, and obviously there's differences even within all nations on this construct, but it's important to see what are the reasons why they develop to help people understand each other more around the world. I'm going to have to go through this very quickly, but we were very interested to see, can we see if this construct applies to help us understand our own diversity? We don't really know much about the 50 states and cultural diversity. We don't really study it. We study cross-national differences, but we know there's great diversity. Why is illicit substance abuse greater in Hawaii and New Hampshire relative to Mississippi and Ohio, but discrimination claims, as evidenced by the EEOC, are much greater in the latter than the former? Or why do Colorado and Connecticut score higher on personality dimensions, like low on trait conscientiousness, but high on openness, whereas Alabama and Kansas are the exact opposite in terms of state-level personality? Or why does Oregon and Vermont have high levels of creativity, but low levels of social organization, a lot of divorce, a lot of mobility in the population, whereas other states exhibit the exact opposite pattern? And we were interested in really analyzing a wide range of data that we have at our disposal in the US to see, can we see if tight loose can really explain a lot of these differences? And the answer, in short, is yes. We have a new paper coming out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that shows through our own archival indices, where we have looked at the construct of strength of norms and permissiveness at the state level with indices such as, is there corporate punishment allowed in schools? What percentage of students are hit in schools? What states still have the death penalty? What are the severity of punishments for various violations? As well as other indices of tightness related to access of alcohol, what percentage of counties are dry in a state, what's the ambient diversity in states, and so forth. And what you see is that when you factor analyze these items, they're all extremely intercorrelated. They come up with a very solid factor. And it relates in the states. You should see, by the way, that many would have probably expected that the southern states are the tightest, and we'll see later what ecological and historical foundations might have to say about that. And the East and the West Coast tend to be the loosest, and I have the ranking I can also send to anyone. What we see is that it's related to a lot of different data, the index itself. It relates to other databases. We always want to see is there some convergent validity. You see that tight states perceive norm deviant actions more socially harmful. They desire greater law enforcement and the use of force regardless to maintain law and order, desire greater media restrictions, are more isolationist, have lower mobility. They tend to vote Republican, so there's some connection here to conservatism. But the most important thing for us was to see, was there an ecological historical foundation for this? And sure enough, what we can see is some similar patterns. We see that tight states have much higher natural disasters, environmental vulnerabilities. They have much fewer natural resources. They have higher disease and health vulnerabilities across a wide range of indicators. These are all controlling for various other economic factors. They also have greater rural populations. In the US 50 states, there was no robust association between population density, like we found in this international study. In part, we think because we have a restriction of range. We don't have anything comparable to 18,000 people per square mile in a state in the United States, like Singapore. We've also looked at the history of threat. I mean, clearly the United States doesn't have a lot of threat on its soil, but we do have things like the Civil War that we can analyze. And actually, a lot of historians would argue that the Civil War was really a foreign occupation of the North on the South, who was threatening their livelihood and threatening, as Woodard says, threatening their tradition, their heritage, and their way of life. And what we were interested to see was those states that had the greatest percentage of slaves and ergo had the most threat to their livelihood and their culture, are they the tightest today? And in fact, you can see a pretty robust association. I mean, by the way, the fact that you can find that data is really a small miracle. We just thought, can we find the percentage of slave owners in the state? And we can for a big variety of our states. We also see that there's greater military recruitment today in states that are tight, greater ambient perception that there's threat in these states on other indicators. We also looked at personality through other data, and you can see that tight states have higher conscientiousness. This is reflecting more dutifulness and desire for orderliness, and they have lower openness. Tight states also have certain outcomes that are associated with them. They have higher social organization. This is lower divorce and less mobility, and they have higher self-control. They have less substance abuse and less illegal drug use. We looked to see whether they have less credit card debt, and in fact, the bivariate correlation was yes, but once you factor in poverty, that relationship goes away, because if you don't have a lot of money, then you clearly don't have a lot of potential for credit card debt. So we're very careful to see which one of these relationships are stable. What's interesting to us is that tight states had lower creativity. This is as indexed by percentage of artists per capita and patents per capita. And they also had much higher levels of discrimination and inequality. As indexed by EEOC claims, percentage of minorities owning businesses, even controlling for the number of minorities in the state as well. So I just want to say, I have just a couple of minutes to just mention a couple of ongoing extensions of this, kind of pushing the envelope on can we understand the implications of this cultural divide for other levels. There's quite a bit of work going on in organizational behavior, and including in finance. I just got a paper sent to me by someone at Georgia Tech that just published a paper in the Journal of Financial Economics on tightness and its implication for stock synchronicity, with tight countries having much higher synchronicity among stock buying and selling. There's some work on CEO discretion that Hamrick published a couple years ago in the Strategic Management Journal, some emerging work on leadership and tightness and HRM strength, and negotiation. So there's quite a bit happening now in the organizational arena. We've now returned our attention through some DoD grants to looking at the neurobiological foundations of tightness. We're doing quite a bit of work with EEG, just looking at how quickly do people at the level of the neuron detect norm violations, and how upset do people get in these very implicit measures. We've been working on this in China and the US. And our real question here is does what's happening at the neurobiological level mediate differences in behavior across cultures? I will also mention that we can see that this can be primed, this construct, temporarily. It's not something that's just chronic. You can see it after the Boston bombing. We went directly out and sent surveys out to Boston after that happened to see whether people desired greater constraint, and the answer is yes. We also prime it in the laboratory, and we also been starting to do some mathematical modeling of the construct. And I have papers on all these things. I do want to say one final thing about sort of intercultural interactions, was where we started this conversation, well, one-way conversation, that we're very interested to see what happens when these cultures meet. And we've been starting to study students, sojourners who are going across Tightness cultures, presenting this summer at a conference. And what we find consistently is that people experience much more stress when they're going to tight cultures, but that certain types of personalities do fare much better in tight cultures. People who are very, very open do very well in tight cultures. By contrast, interestingly, people who come to loose cultures do pretty well in terms of adjustment, but they do much better when they're low on agreeableness and they're high on emotionality. So there's certain culture by personality interactions that I think we need to think about when you're deciding where to go and thinking about your own personality. Where do you best fit? Because really there'll be some consequences for anxiety and stress when we go through these transitions. Last but not least, I'll just say that this quintessential question of, which is better? This is really something that we're finding is really something that people have a visceral reaction to. When we're doing interviews in the Middle East about perceptions of Americans, what you see is some really extreme stereotyping about Americans. You really don't want to see these interviews, just in terms of how permissive and how decadent and how morally corrupt people perceive Americans' way of life. It's loose, but it's an extreme version of looseness. And vice versa, when we interview Americans and we ask them about their perceptions of people in the Middle East, a lot of their impressions are along the lines of this clash of morality of tightness, of this is excessively constrained. We don't tend to think about people in the Middle East being in weak situations, having dancing and partying and reading poetry, even though they are in these situations. Likewise, people in the region don't tend to think of Americans being in more formal, strong situations like work and church. So we're developing some interventions to try to see can we show that these are extreme perceptions, that they might be some gist of reality with constraint and latitude, but that somehow we really have a really miscalibration in terms of how people are perceiving us around the world. And a lot of it is through the media, because people do think about us through American movies. The final point I want to make is which one is better. People constantly asking that, is it better, is tightness, a lot of people say, well, it would be great to be loose. Freedom is really important. And this is a debate that's been going on, of course, for centuries, and Durkheim in sociology, Eric Fromm in psychology, and Sioni and GW actually, Amitai, has also commented on this. And you see it also a tension that we talk about a lot in the United States with the recent NSA monitoring. Many people would argue that having autonomy is important for societal happiness and for productivity. Other people would argue that excessive amounts of autonomy is really also terrible for happiness. And the answer is actually both camps are right. If we analyze data across the board, this national level, and look at things like happiness, and we look at how our scale predicts societal level happiness, what you'll see across the board on many societal indicators is that extreme levels of either tightness or looseness happen to be very bad for a lot of things, for different reasons, we think. Excessive constraint and being stifled, Durkheim would say that this leads to sort of fatalistic suicide, where you're trying to escape this constraint, whereas in contexts that are extremely loose, there's a sense of anomie and a sense of meaninglessness, and what he talked about as egoistic suicide. You see this with depression, higher levels of depression in both very tight and very loose cultures. You see this with suicide. This is male suicide, but also applies to female suicide. You see it with blood pressure levels, and you see it also with GDP. So my sort of ending point is that when we're thinking about these contrasts, there's no linear relationship per se with societal health. There really is a matter of moderation. We're very interested in what happens to the extremes in terms of pendulum shifts and how the implications they have for cultural change, because we think that they're really not as sustainable states that have the potential for massive cultural changes. You see in some contexts, like Ukraine, for example, was very, very loose in our data 10 years ago. So we're trying to understand now sort of the factors that cause societies to have rapid cultural change. I will say that on the World Value Survey data, that when people are asked if change is going to happen in your country, will it be incremental or will it be catastrophic? And it's clear from that data that people in loose cultures say that change happens incrementally. But people in tight cultures on those very same measures say, no, if change happens, it's going to be catastrophic. It's going to have to be very nonlinear. And that's what we would predict in terms of understanding cultural change. So I know I've been up here for a while. I'd like to stop here and say thank you very much for your attention. And I have my website is here. I do research, teaching, consulting. For anyone interested in contacting me, I'd love to talk more. And all this stuff is on my website. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to a lot of